Key concept 3.5. A variety of motives and methods led to the intensification of European global control and increased tensions among the great powers. What we're going to focus on today in this lesson is a study of the new imperialism. The old imperialism occurred between the 16th and 18th centuries. During that time period, European powers didn't acquire territory in Africa and Asia, but rather built a series of trading stations. The British in India, the Dutch in Indonesia and Ceylon, as well as the Portuguese and others in Africa, as well, will help trade to flourish during that time period. The exception to that, though, with the old imperialism was the New World, and Spain claimed an enormous empire in Central and South America, England, Portugal, and France as well. This, however, changes during the 19th century, and the new imperialism began in the late 1800s or late 19th century in both Africa and Asia. And just to give you an idea of the extent of the new imperialism, in 1800, Europeans controlled about 7% of the world's territory. By 1914, they controlled 84%. It was said that the British Empire controlled about 25% of the world's population and 20% of the world's territory. The sun never sets on the British Empire. One could travel around the world by railroad and sea, moving only through British territories, which included Australia, Canada, India, as well as colonies in Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean. Usually, Europeans colonized Africa and Asia by using military force to take control of local governments. They exploited local economies for raw materials, and they imposed Western values to benefit the backwards colonies. And much of it was due to superiority of weaponry, especially machine guns, and also the use of quinine. And Britain's control of Egypt, India, and so forth would become kind of the model for what we call this new imperialism. Key concept focuses on European nations were driven by economic, political, and cultural motivations in their new imperial ventures in Asia and Africa. And one of the major causes of this new era were the search for raw materials and markets. Remember, the Americas had broke free during the Revolutionary era, but the Industrial Revolution created a surplus of goods, and capitalists sought new markets to sell these goods to. And it was difficult to get new markets as well because colonial peoples were generally too poor to purchase goods. But what they found was that there's an abundance of raw materials in Africa, including ivory and rubber in the Congo, diamonds and gold in South Africa, cotton in India, and so forth. Another reason for the new imperialism during this time period was for missionary work. A strong current of religious revivalism had occurred in Western Europe in the mid-19th century, particularly strong among the middle classes. And this led to a new emphasis on spreading Christianity to Africa and Asia. As far as the results of missionary activity, far more successful in sub-Saharan Africa than in Asia or Islamic North Africa. Another reason would be geopolitics, the fact that these national rivalries and strategic concerns. So on one hand, there was increased tensions that occurred between the haves, such as the British and French empires, and the have-nots, such as Germany and Italy, who came late to imperialistic competition. And then there was also these strategic concerns, new military, naval bases that were needed to protect the country's imperial interests against other European powers. And finally, it was justified through the ideology of social Darwinism and the desire to spread civilization. Herbert Spencer adapted Darwinism, the survival of the fittest aspects, and rationalized that the conquest of weak countries by stronger, more civilized ones was justified. And this justified the conquest by the Europeans. It justified the military superiority. Furthermore, the idea of the white man's burden, that basically a racist and patronizing view that preached that superior Westerners had an obligation to bring their culture to uncivilized people in other parts of the world. This phrase was coined by Rudyard Kipling in his poem by the same name, and ultimately this whole idea that civilization needed to be developed in these less civilized parts of the world. In 1880, Europeans controlled 10% of Africa. By 1914, they controlled the entire continent except for Liberia and Ethiopia. Penetration into the African interior began in the late 1870s when Belgium took control of the Congo. Britain's conquest of Egypt in the early 1880s became that, once again, this model for this new imperialism. And the Berlin Conference in 1884 and 85 established the rules among the European powers for carving up Africa. And thus we're going to see, Africa carved into European colonies. Once again, Congo becomes a colony of Belgium. This was really one of the most brutal areas. Leopold II was the British Belgian king, and ultimately, it really kind of emerged the Congo as Leopold's personal possession. The Belgian rulers savagely treated the indigenous peoples in their quest for rubber and ivory. And at one point, by 1908, the Belgian parliament was horrified by the revelations of the atrocities and took it away from Leo, making it into a Belgian colony. Leopold's incursion into the Congo began questions of the political fate of Black Africa, as did Britain's conquest of Egypt as well. As stated earlier, the Berlin Conference established the rules, and some of the provisions of the Berlin Conference included that no imperial power could claim a territory in Africa unless it effectively controlled that territory, that slavery and the slave trade would not exist, and ultimately, it was sought to prevent international conflicts between the European nations over the issue of imperialism. As far as Asia, we're going to see different models of imperialism that are going to exist throughout Asia. And I like to divide it into really three working models. The first, that of India. For a long time, India had consisted of trading stations with a very heavy British presence and ultimately British control during the Mughal Empire, but officially still independent. However, by the late 1850s, Indian independence ended. Revolt amongst Indian military officers in the British Army, known as the Sepoy Rebellion, led to the British just taking direct control of India. And ultimately, India, after the Sepoy Mutiny, India was ruled by the British Parliament in London. It was administered by a tiny all-white civil service in India. And essentially, Queen Victoria was named Empress of India. There were some reforms in India. A modern system of secondary education was developed, mainly to train Indian civil servants. There was some economic development. 25,000 miles of railway were built. There were some irrigation projects. India's cotton industry became the fourth largest in the world. But there was also a lot of opposition to British rule. The British created the Indian National Congress to train Indians to run India along British lines, but a lot of educated, predominantly Hindu Indians increasingly demanded more equality and self-government, a concept we'll talk about in our next period 4, when we talk about the rise of Gandhi. A second model of imperialism in Asia is that of China and spheres of influence. And essentially, by the late 19th century, much of eastern China had become subject to domination by Britain, France, Russia, Japan, and Germany, despite the Manchu dynasty that was still effectively in control. This whole idea of this spheres of influence and the concept of extraterritoriality led to a lot of resentment among the Chinese, ultimately leading to the Boxer Rebellion in 1900 as well. And, China, as far as independence goes, like I said, on paper, she was independent, but in reality, she was controlled by foreigners, and the foreigners had that control throughout. And finally, Japan. Japan was opened to the West for trading in 1853 by Commodore Perry from the United States. And Japan watched what was going on with great interest amongst its neighbors. And instead of letting the European powers imperialize Japan, Japan herself became an imperial power. She started conquering lands from China. She gained Taiwan in 1894 and 95, which further showed China's weaknesses. In addition, she took Korea in 1910 and became involved in the First World War, mainly in order to gain more territory. Industrial and technological developments, basically the Second Industrial Revolution, is what facilitated European control of global empires. And we talked earlier about advanced weaponry. Some of this advanced weaponry included, like I said, the machine gun, the breech-loading rifle. And because of this, we're going to see great victories, especially in Africa, by the Europeans. Uh, it is very easy for 300 European troops to conquer 20,000 Africans because of the use of machine guns. And one example, part of the conferences, they had decided not to sell modern weapons to Africa, so they really weren't fighting against, they were fighting against people with primitive weapons. One country that did escape that was Ethiopia, and Ethiopia was able to buy modern weapons. And when the Italian army marched in against Menelik II of Ethiopia in the 1890s, the Ethiopians were able to fire back, thus keeping their independence until the 1930s. Also, communication and transportation technologies allowed for the creation of European empires. As the Europeans were able to go into interior Africa, they built railroads. They had steamships, and they had the use of radios, later on telegraphs, and later on telephones. And this will enable them to colonize much larger areas than they had been able to colonize in Africa under the old imperialism. Perhaps more importantly were advances in medicine which supported European control, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. Um, we know about Louis Pasteur's theory of diseases and pasteurization. There was also, during the 19th century, the use of anesthesia and antiseptics. But probably one of the greatest developments for the conquering of Africa by the Europeans was the fact that quinine could be used to combat malaria. In fact, British soldiers often drank their gin and tonic, because tonic is made from quinine, during this time period, and that became the drink of choice, partly because of its effects against malaria. Imperial endeavors, affected society, diplomacy, and culture in Europe, and created resistance to foreign control abroad. There was diplomatic tensions among the European states that really strained the alliance system. The Berlin Conference, which we had previously talked about, was called, in order to keep those tensions down. However, we're going to see a series of tensions between the European powers over imperialism, ultimately leading to Britain siding with France and Russia in their alliance against Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy in the alliance system prior to the First World War. One of these tensions are going to be caused by the Boer War. The Boer War was fought, I believe, from 1899 to 1902, and the British were trying to conquer the area known as South Africa. And the group that lived there, the Boers or the Afrikaners, were white descendants of Dutch white settlers who had basically subjugated the black majority. When gold was discovered in the Transvaal region, the British went in and went to war against the Boers. They used reconcentration camps. There were some atrocities committed. And although the British defeated the Boers in 1902 and allowed them to continue their very strict system of apartheid, a topic that will become a major interest in the 20th century, there was a lot of tension between Germany and Britain. Germany, under Kaiser Wilhelm II, publicly condemned the British for these atrocities and consistently challenged British authority. And the British, still focusing more on a world empire and trying to keep out of European affairs during its period of splendid isolation, is going to find itself drawn closer and closer to France. Another issue that's also going to upset the British, would be Germany's announcement to build the Berlin-Baghdad Railway. Although this railway wasn't completed until the Second World War, during the time, the railroad went right through the Ottoman Empire, which was a direct threat to both Britain and Russia. Furthermore, the British were afraid about being cut off from some of its trade routes with its most important colony, India, and we see the tension continue to grow between those two countries. And finally, in 1905, the Germans decided to challenge the British and French. The year prior to, in 1904, the British and the French signed the Entente Cordiale, which essentially was a treaty of friendship between the two. They removed any differences they had over colonies and began to work together. The Germans decided to test this resolve in 1905 by challenging French control of Morocco. The British defended the French, the Germans backed down. There was a second Moroccan crisis 6 years later. And overall, this is, these issues over imperialism between the haves and the have-nots, between the British haves and the German have-nots, will be one of the major causes of the First World War. Germany was pushing Britain further into an alliance with France and Russia, and we'll see that continue, and we'll talk about that in period 4. Finally, another issue was that imperial endeavors significantly affected society, diplomacy, and culture in Europe. The Europeans benefited and learned much from their interactions with non-Europeans. And so what we're going to see, non-European peoples influence the styles and subject matters of artists and writers, provoke debate over the acquisition of colonies. So let's talk first about the influence of styles and subject matters of artists and writers. In particular, the print shown here is by Paul Gauguin, and this idea of primitivism and the naturalness of the colonial people. Gauguin spent much time in Tahiti, and we're going to see this influence there. Another influence not shown will be on post-impressionist and impressionist works. Because of their interactions, we're going to see a lot of Japanese art influence the impressionists, as well as African tribal art. As far as writers, we're going to see, you know, some of the writings during this time period, such as Jules Verne and his literature of exploration, Conrad's The Heart of Darkness, that will all take place and use these ideas from their interactions with the non-Europeans. As I said earlier, it also provoked great debate over the acquisition of colonies. As non-Europeans became educated in Western values, they challenged imperialism. They challenged the dominance of the Europeans. And even within the European countries, there is great debate over their treatment, how much civilization. I think I stated earlier, when news of the atrocities in Prince Leopold's or King Leopold's Congo came out, the Belgian parliament nationalized the Congo and put it under direct control of the Belgian parliament rather than the king himself. Also, some challenges to European imperialism will occur during this time period. I talked earlier about Gandhi and the Indian Congress Party after the Sepoy Rebellion. The Chinese Boxer Rebellion was another challenge as well. And ultimately, in many ways, Japan could even be seen as challenging. The fact that during the Meiji Restoration that they decided to become an imperial power itself challenged European dominance. The Japanese even went to war and defeated the Russians in 1904 and 1905, proving their advancements. Our next review will focus on key concept 3.6. It's going to talk about some of the European ideas and culture during the 19th century.